The evening sun painted the Virginia sky in shades of orange and pink as Colonel Marcus Thompson drove down the quiet suburban street. His military uniform hung neatly in the back seat, still crisp from the dry cleaners. After 23 years of dedicated service to his country, Marcus had learned to carry himself with dignity and composure in every situation. He had commanded troops in 2 overseas deployments, earned numerous medals for his leadership, and mentored countless young soldiers. But nothing in his extensive military training had quite prepared him for what was about to unfold on this ordinary Tuesday evening. Marcus was heading home from the base, where he worked as a senior officer in the logistics division. His wife Patricia had texted him earlier about picking up groceries for dinner. Their daughter Jasmine was coming home from college for the weekend, and Patricia wanted to make her favorite meal. Marcus smiled at the thought as he turned onto Maple Avenue, a tree-lined street in a neighborhood where they had lived for the past 5 years. The houses were modest but well-maintained, with manicured lawns and American flags hanging from several porches. As he slowed down to check the address of the grocery store on his phone, Marcus noticed a police cruiser in his rearview mirror. The flashing lights suddenly activated, casting red and blue reflections across his dashboard. Marcus felt his heart rate increase slightly, though he knew he had done nothing wrong. He was driving under the speed limit. His registration was current and his vehicle was in perfect condition. Still, as a black man in America, he understood that traffic stops could be unpredictable. He had given his own son the talk about staying calm, keeping hands visible, and being respectful during police encounters. Marcus carefully pulled his SUV to the side of the road, making sure to use his turn signal. He rolled down his window completely, placed both hands on the steering wheel at 10 and 2 and waited. Through his side mirror, he watched as a white police officer stepped out of the cruiser. The officer was in his early 30s with a stocky build and a crew cut. His name tag read Officer Derek Mitchell. Derek approached the vehicle with one hand resting on his service weapon, his face stern and unwelcoming. What happened next would change both of their lives forever. Derek walked up to the driver's side window with an aggressive posture that immediately put Marcus on edge. Before Marcus could even greet him or ask what the problem was, Derek barked out his first command in a harsh accusatory tone that seemed disproportionate to a routine traffic stop. The officer's body language was tense, almost hostile, as if he had already decided Marcus was a threat before any interaction had taken place. Marcus remained calm, his military training kicking in automatically. He spoke in measured tones, explaining that he was simply driving home from work. Derek interrupted him, demanding to see his license and registration immediately. Marcus slowly informed the officer that he would need to reach into his glove compartment for the registration and into his wallet for his license. He moved deliberately, narrating each action to ensure there would be no misunderstanding about his movements. As Marcus retrieved his documents, Derek's hand tightened on his weapon. The officer's eyes narrowed with suspicion, scanning the interior of the vehicle as if expecting to find something incriminating. Marcus handed over his license and registration through the window, maintaining eye contact and keeping his voice steady. Derek snatched the documents without a word and returned to his patrol car to run the information through his system. Marcus sat in his vehicle, hands back on the steering wheel, trying to control his breathing. He thought about Patricia waiting at home, about Jasmine's upcoming visit, about the normal evening he had planned. He wondered what he had done to warrant being pulled over. He had not been speeding, had not run any stop signs, and had not violated any traffic laws that he was aware of. The minutes ticked by slowly as he waited for Derek to return. When Derek came back to the window, his demeanor had not improved. In fact, he seemed even more agitated. He claimed that Marcus had been driving suspiciously and demanded to know where he was going and where he had been. Marcus answered honestly, explaining his route from the military base to his home. Derek's next question caught Marcus off guard. The officer asked what Marcus did for work, his tone implying disbelief that Marcus could afford the newer model SUV he was driving. Marcus explained that he was a colonel in the United States Army, stationed at the nearby base. He offered to show his military identification as proof. Derek's face twisted into a sneer, and he made a comment that made Marcus's blood run cold. The officer suggested that Marcus was lying, that he had probably stolen the vehicle, and that his story about being a military officer was just a cover for criminal activity. The accusation was so absurd, so divorced from reality, that Marcus almost could not believe what he was hearing. The situation escalated rapidly from that point. Derek ordered Marcus to step out of the vehicle, his hand now hovering over his holstered weapon in a threatening manner. Marcus complied, moving slowly and keeping his hands visible at all times. He was 6 feet tall and in good physical condition from years of military fitness standards, but he made himself appear as non-threatening as possible. Derek immediately became more aggressive once Marcus was standing on the roadside. Without warning or justification, Derek grabbed Marcus and spun him around, pushing him roughly against the side of his own vehicle. Marcus felt his face pressed against the cool metal as Derek yanked his arms behind his back. The officer was breathing heavily, almost excited, as he began to pat down Marcus aggressively. Marcus remained silent, not resisting, calculating every move carefully. He knew that any sudden movement could be interpreted as aggression, and he had seen too many news stories about traffic stops that ended in tragedy. Then came the moment that would be seared into Marcus's memory forever. As Derek finished the pat-down and found nothing, his frustration seemed to mount. Marcus could hear the officer muttering under his breath, making derogatory comments that revealed the true nature of this encounter. Derek stepped back, and Marcus heard the distinctive sound of a weapon being drawn from its holster. His entire body tensed as he felt the cold steel of a gun barrel press against the back of his head. Time seemed to slow down in that moment. Marcus thought about his wife, his daughter, his son who was serving overseas in the Marine Corps. He thought about the soldiers he commanded, the young men and women who looked up to him for leadership and guidance. He thought about all the times he had worn his uniform with pride, believing that his service to his country meant something. And now he was on the side of a road, a gun pressed to his skull, being treated like a criminal for no reason other than the color of his skin. Derek's voice was shaking now, a mixture of adrenaline and something darker. He yelled at Marcus to stop resisting, even though Marcus had not moved a muscle. He accused Marcus of reaching for something, a complete fabrication that Marcus knew could be used to justify whatever happened next. Marcus's military training took over, and he responded in a clear, authoritative voice that he was not resisting, that his hands were visible, and that he was a commissioned officer in the United States Army. The mention of his military rank seemed to enrage Derek rather than calm him down. The officer pressed the gun harder against Marcus's head and told him to shut up, using a racial slur that left no doubt about the true motivation behind this traffic stop. Marcus felt a cold rage building inside him, but he suppressed it with every ounce of discipline he possessed. He knew that showing anger could cost him his life. So he stood there, perfectly still, with a gun to his head, waiting for whatever would come next. A car drove past slowly, and Marcus heard Derek curse under his breath. The presence of a potential witness seemed to make the officer nervous. Derek lowered the gun slightly but did not holster it. He continued to keep Marcus pinned against the vehicle, his free hand gripping Marcus's shoulder hard enough to leave bruises. Marcus could hear the officer's radio crackling, and he prayed that backup was on the way, hoping that another officer might bring some sanity to this surreal and terrifying situation. The sound of another police cruiser approaching brought a mixture of hope and dread to Marcus. He remained motionless against his vehicle, Derek's gun still drawn though no longer pressed directly against his head. The backup officer who emerged from the second patrol car was an older man with gray hair and a calmer demeanor. His name tag identified him as Sergeant Robert Hayes, and he had the weathered look of someone who had been on the force for decades. Robert approached the scene with visible confusion, taking in the sight of Marcus pressed against his SUV and Derek standing with his weapon drawn. The sergeant's face showed immediate concern as he called out to Derek, asking for a situation report. Derek's response was rushed and defensive, claiming that Marcus had been acting suspiciously, driving erratically, and had refused to comply with orders. Every word was a distortion of the truth, and Marcus felt his jaw clench in frustration. Robert moved closer, his hand subtly gesturing for Derek to lower his weapon. The young officer hesitated before finally holstering his gun, though his hand remained hovering near it. The sergeant then addressed Marcus directly, asking for his side of the story in a tone that was professional and neutral. Marcus explained in concise, military-precise language exactly what had happened. He detailed the traffic stop, his complete cooperation, the unfounded accusations, and the moment Derek had pointed a gun at his head while using racial slurs. Derek immediately interrupted, calling Marcus a liar and insisting that he had felt threatened. The young officer's voice was rising again, his face reddening as he tried to justify his actions. Robert held up a hand, silencing Derek with a look that spoke of authority and experience. The sergeant asked Marcus for his identification, and Marcus carefully reached into his pocket to retrieve his military ID card, narrating his movements as he had done earlier. When Robert examined the ID, his eyebrows rose significantly. He looked from the card to Marcus and then to Derek with an expression of disbelief. The sergeant asked Marcus to confirm his rank, and Marcus stated clearly that he was a colonel in the United States Army, currently serving as a senior logistics officer at Fort Belmont, just 15 miles from their current location. The words hung in the air like a bomb that had just been dropped on the scene. Derek's face went pale. The realization of what he had done seemed to hit him like a physical blow. He had just held at gunpoint, threatened and racially abused a senior military officer. Robert's expression hardened as he processed this information. The sergeant stepped away to make a call on his radio, speaking in low tones that Marcus could not quite make out. Derek stood frozen, his earlier aggression replaced by what looked like panic. Marcus was finally allowed to stand normally, and he straightened his back, squaring his shoulders in a posture that came naturally after more than 2 decades in uniform. He looked Derek directly in the eyes, and the young officer could not hold his gaze. The power dynamic had shifted completely, but Marcus took no satisfaction in it. He felt exhausted, angry, and deeply disappointed. This was not the first time he had faced racism, but having a gun pointed at his head by someone sworn to protect and serve had crossed a line he never imagined would be crossed so blatantly. Robert returned from his radio call with a grim expression. He informed Marcus that a supervisor was on the way and apologized for the incident, though his words felt inadequate given what had just transpired. The sergeant then turned to Derek and ordered him to return to his patrol car immediately. Derek opened his mouth as if to argue, but thought better of it when he saw Robert's expression. The young officer walked back to his cruiser with slumped shoulders, the swagger completely gone from his step. While they waited for the supervisor, Robert engaged Marcus in conversation, asking about his military service. The sergeant shared that his own son was in the Navy, and there was a respect in his voice that had been completely absent from Derek's interaction. Marcus answered politely but remained guarded. He understood that Robert was trying to defuse the situation and perhaps minimize the damage, but Marcus had already decided that this incident would not be swept under the rug. A third vehicle arrived within minutes, this one an unmarked sedan driven by a lieutenant named Sarah Chen. She was a woman in her mid-40s with sharp eyes and an efficient manner. Sarah listened as Robert briefed her on the situation, his words carefully neutral but the facts speaking for themselves. She then approached Marcus and introduced herself, expressing her concern about what had occurred and assuring him that the matter would be taken seriously. Marcus appreciated her directness, but had heard similar promises before, in different contexts. He asked Sarah point-blank what would happen to Derek. She explained the process of filing a formal complaint, the internal affairs investigation that would follow, and the potential consequences that could range from retraining to termination. Marcus made it clear that he intended to pursue every available avenue to ensure accountability, including filing complaints with both the police department and through military channels since the incident involved a service member being targeted while in civilian status. Sarah nodded, acknowledging the severity of the situation. She asked Marcus if he would be willing to provide a detailed statement, and he agreed without hesitation. While they talked, Marcus noticed that Derek had not emerged from his patrol car. The young officer was sitting behind the wheel, his head in his hands. Marcus felt a complicated mixture of emotions looking at him. There was anger, certainly, but also a kind of sad recognition that Derek's actions were a symptom of a larger disease that infected too many corners of American society. The process of giving his statement took over an hour. Marcus sat in the back of Sarah's sedan, recounting every detail of the encounter while she took notes on a tablet. He was precise and factual, drawing on his military training to provide times-exact quotes where possible, and a clear sequence of events. Sarah asked clarifying questions but did not challenge his account. When he described the moment Derek pressed the gun to his head and used racial slurs, Sarah's expression showed genuine disgust. After the statement was complete, Sarah informed Marcus that he was free to go. She provided him with a case number and her direct contact information, encouraging him to call if he remembered any additional details or had any concerns. Marcus thanked her and walked back to his SUV, which had been sitting on the roadside throughout the entire ordeal. He noticed that several of his neighbors had gathered at the end of the street, watching from a distance. News of the incident would spread quickly through the community. Marcus sat in his driver's seat for a moment before starting the engine. His hands were shaking now that the adrenaline was wearing off. He gripped the steering wheel tightly, taking deep breaths to calm himself. The grocery run he had planned was forgotten. He just wanted to get home to Patricia, to be in a safe space where he could process what had just happened. As he pulled away from the curb, he glanced in his rearview mirror and saw Derek still sitting in his patrol car, watched over by Robert and Sarah. The drive home took only 10 minutes, but it felt like an eternity. Marcus's mind kept replaying the moment when he felt the gun against his head, the cold realization that his life hung in the balance, based on the whims of a racist cop with a badge and a weapon. He thought about all the times he had commanded soldiers in dangerous situations, making split-second decisions that could mean life or death. He had faced those moments with confidence, backed by training and purpose. But being utterly powerless on that roadside, unable to defend himself without risking his life, was a different kind of terror entirely. When Marcus pulled into his driveway, Patricia was waiting at the front door. She must have sensed something was wrong because she came rushing out before he even had the car in park. Marcus stepped out, and his wife immediately noticed the scraped dirt on his shirt from where Derek had pushed him against the vehicle. Her face filled with alarm as she reached for him, asking what had happened. Marcus wrapped his arms around her, holding her tight as the emotions he had been suppressing finally began to surface. Inside their home, Marcus sat at the kitchen table while Patricia made tea with shaking hands. He told her everything, watching as her expression shifted from shock to horror to rage. When he got to the part about the gun pressed to his head, Patricia let out a small cry and covered her mouth. Tears rolled down her cheeks as she processed the fact that she had come so close to losing her husband over nothing more than the color of his skin and the prejudices of one officer. Patricia wanted to call their lawyer immediately, and Marcus agreed. They also needed to inform their children, especially Jasmine, before she arrived for the weekend. Marcus dreaded making those calls, knowing how his daughter would react. She had always been passionate about social justice issues, and this would fuel her anger at a system that claimed to be fair, but so often proved otherwise. Their son Marcus Jr., who went by MJ, would be furious too, possibly questioning whether his own service to the country was worth it if his father could be treated this way. As Patricia made the calls, Marcus sat alone for a moment, looking at the family photos on the wall. There were pictures of him in uniform receiving commendations, images of his change of command ceremony, photos with troops he had led. He had given so much of his life to serving his country, believing in the ideals of justice and equality that America claimed to represent. And yet on a quiet suburban street in Virginia, those ideals had meant nothing in the face of Derek Mitchell's hatred and prejudice. The phone rang, interrupting his thoughts. It was Sarah Chen, calling to inform him that Derek had been placed on administrative leave pending the investigation. She also mentioned that the incident had been captured on Derek's body camera, which would provide crucial evidence for the case. Marcus felt a grim satisfaction at this news. The footage would prove beyond doubt that he had done nothing wrong, and that Derek's actions were unjustified and motivated by racial bias. That evening, Marcus did not sleep. He lay in bed next to Patricia, staring at the ceiling while his mind refused to quiet. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw Derek's face twisted with hatred, felt the cold steel of the gun barrel against his skull. Patricia held his hand throughout the night, offering silent support. She knew her husband well enough to understand that tired of living in a country that claimed to value his service while simultaneously treating him as less than human because of his skin color. But he was not tired enough to give up the fight. At home, the Thompson family adapted to a new normal. Jasmine had returned to college but called every day, monitoring the news coverage and organizing solidarity events on campus. MJ, who was overseas, sent messages of support and anger, frustrated that he could not be there for his father in person. Patricia became Marcus's rock, handling the logistics of the legal case, screening calls from reporters and providing emotional support when the weight of it all threatened to crush him. Marcus began experiencing symptoms he recognized from his training on trauma responses. He had trouble sleeping, startled easily at unexpected sounds, and felt hypervigilant when driving. He avoided the street where the traffic stop had occurred, taking a longer route home even though it was inefficient. Patricia gently suggested he speak with a counselor, and Marcus reluctantly agreed. The therapist, a woman named Dr. Angela Foster who specialized in trauma and racial stress, helped him understand that what he was experiencing was a normal response to an abnormal and deeply threatening situation. One evening, about a month after the incident, Marcus received an unexpected phone call. It was from Robert Hayes, the sergeant who had been the backup officer at the scene. Robert asked if he could meet with Marcus privately, not as part of any official investigation, but as one person to another. Marcus was hesitant but curious, so he agreed to meet at a coffee shop halfway between their locations. The meeting was tense at first. Robert looked uncomfortable, fidgeting with his coffee cup as he struggled to find the right words. Finally, he spoke plainly. He had been a police officer for 28 years, he said, and he had seen a lot of things in that time. He had witnessed racism within the department, officers who viewed communities of color as enemies rather than citizens to protect. He had tried to mentor younger officers like Derek, to teach them better ways, but he had not always been successful. Robert told Marcus that he had watched the full body camera footage as part of the investigation. He said that what Derek had done was inexcusable, a complete violation of everything policing should be. The sergeant's voice cracked as he apologized for not intervening sooner, for not immediately recognizing the situation for what it was. He admitted that he had hesitated because Derek was his partner, and that hesitation had allowed Marcus to suffer longer than necessary. Marcus listened to Robert's words, studying the older man's face for signs of insincerity. What he saw was genuine remorse and shame. Marcus appreciated the apology, but he also felt a deep sadness that this conversation was necessary at all. He asked Robert why good officers like him allowed bad officers like Derek to continue serving. The sergeant had no good answer, only the weak excuse that the system made it difficult to remove problem officers, and that loyalty among police often trumped accountability. As they parted ways, Robert shared one more piece of information. He had submitted his own report about Derek's conduct during the traffic stop, recommending termination. He had also reached out to other officers who had worked with Derek, and a pattern was emerging. There had been previous complaints about Derek's aggressive behavior and racial bias, but they had been dismissed or resulted in minimal discipline. Robert was now working with internal affairs to document this pattern, hoping it would strengthen the case against Derek. Marcus drove home from that meeting with mixed feelings, processing everything as the story moved toward its next critical phase. 2 months after the traffic stop, David Richardson called Marcus with significant news. The internal affairs investigation had been completed, and Derek Mitchell was being recommended for termination. Additionally, the district attorney's office had reviewed the case and was considering criminal charges for assault and civil rights violations. The body camera footage, combined with Robert Hayes' testimony and the pattern of previous complaints, had built a strong case that even the police union would struggle to defend. Marcus felt a surge of vindication, but it was tempered by the knowledge that this was just one battle in a much larger war. Derek being fired and potentially prosecuted would not change the systemic issues that allowed officers like him to operate with impunity for so long. It would not erase the trauma Marcus had experienced or prevent similar incidents from happening to others. But it was something. It was accountability, rare and precious in cases involving police misconduct. The news broke to the public through a leaked memo, and the media attention intensified once again. Supporters of Derek organized rallies claiming he was being railroaded by political correctness and anti-police sentiment. The police union issued a statement defending Derek's actions as reasonable, given the totality of circumstances, though they were vague about what those circumstances actually were. Counter-protests formed, with community activists and veterans groups demanding justice and policy changes to prevent similar incidents. Marcus found himself thrust into a role he had never sought. He became a symbol, a face for the movement to reform policing and address racial bias in law enforcement. Activists wanted him to speak at rallies. Civil rights organizations invited him to join their boards. Media outlets requested interviews constantly. It was overwhelming for someone who had spent his career focused on military logistics and leading soldiers, not advocating for social change in the public sphere. Patricia encouraged him to use the platform if he felt comfortable doing so. She reminded him that he had a unique perspective as both a black man who had experienced racism and a military leader who understood discipline, accountability, and service. His voice could carry weight in spaces where others might be dismissed. After much consideration, Marcus agreed to give a limited number of carefully chosen interviews and to speak at select events, always with a focus on constructive solutions rather than just criticism. His first major interview was with a respected national news program. The journalist, Carol Martinez, was known for her thorough preparation and fair approach. She asked Marcus to walk through the traffic stop in detail, which he did with calm precision. When she asked how he had remained so composed with a gun to his head, Marcus paused before answering. He explained that his military training had instilled discipline, but more than that, he had understood that any reaction could be used as justification to pull the trigger. He had made himself small, compliant, non-threatening because surviving the encounter was more important than his dignity in that moment. Carol then asked the harder question. Did Marcus believe Derek was just one bad officer, or did he represent a larger problem? Marcus took a deep breath before responding. He spoke carefully, acknowledging that most police officers were good people trying to do a difficult job. But he also stated clearly that there was a systemic problem with how law enforcement interacted with communities of color. The racism was not always as blatant as Derek's actions, but it was there in the statistics, in the disproportionate stops and searches, in the use of force data, in the way officers were trained to view certain neighborhoods as war zones. The interview touched on Marcus's military service and the irony of a decorated officer being treated as a threat in his own country. Marcus spoke about the young soldiers he had commanded, many of them black and brown who had fought bravely for American ideals. He talked about the conversations he had to have with them about how to interact with police when they were off duty, how wearing the uniform protected them, but taking it off made them targets. His voice remained steady, but the pain beneath his words was evident. The interview went viral, shared millions of times across social media. Marcus received thousands of messages from people thanking him for speaking out, sharing their own stories of discrimination and mistreatment. He heard from parents who were afraid for their children, from veterans who had experienced similar incidents, from police officers who admitted the culture within their departments needed to change. The outpouring was both heartening and heartbreaking. Not everyone responded positively. Marcus also received hate mail and threats, some disturbingly specific. His home address was posted online by someone claiming he was a race baiter who hated police. The local police, to their credit, increased patrols around the Thompson home and took the threat seriously. The irony of being protected by the same institution that had traumatized him was not lost on Marcus. 3 months into the process, the district attorney announced that criminal charges would be filed against Derek Mitchell. He was charged with assault, official misconduct, and violation of civil rights under both state and federal law. The announcement came at a press conference where the district attorney, Martin Webb, carefully outlined the evidence supporting the charges. He emphasized that the case was not about being anti-police, but about holding individuals accountable. When they violated the law and the public trust, Derek's arraignment was scheduled for the following week. Marcus attended, sitting in the courtroom gallery with Patricia by his side. It was the first time he had seen Derek since that evening on the roadside. The former officer looked diminished, no longer wearing the uniform that had given him authority. He kept his eyes down, and refusing to look at Marcus even when the charges were read aloud. Derek pleaded not guilty through his attorney, the aggressive defense lawyer named Thomas Brennan, who was known for defending police officers in misconduct cases. The preliminary hearing revealed more details about Derek's history. The defense tried to suppress much of this information, arguing it was prejudicial, but the judge allowed some of it in to establish a pattern of behavior. There had been 5 previous complaints against Derek in his 7 years on the force. 3 involved allegations of excessive force and 2 involved racial profiling. All had been investigated internally and dismissed, or resulted in brief suspensions and retraining. Robert Hayes testified about Derek's conduct, and his words carried weight as a fellow officer breaking the blue wall of silence. The body camera footage was played in court, and even the defense attorney seemed uncomfortable as it unfolded. The video showed Marcus being completely compliant, hands visible at all times, voice calm and respectful. It showed Derek's escalating aggression, his unfounded accusations, and the moment he drew his weapon and pressed it against Marcus's head. The audio captured Derek's racial slur with crystal clarity. Several people in the courtroom audibly gasped when they heard it. Marcus sat stone-faced, reliving the worst moments of his life for the public record. The judge ruled that there was sufficient evidence to proceed to trial, and denied Derek's motion to dismiss the charges. Trial was set for 6 months later, giving both sides time to prepare. David Richardson was pleased with the outcome, but warned Marcus that the trial itself would be even more difficult. He would have to testify in detail about the incident, face cross-examination from Brennan, and endure whatever character attacks the defense might launch. In the months leading up to trial, Marcus tried to maintain some normalcy in his life. He continued his duties on base, though the incident had changed him in ways his colleagues could sense. He was more withdrawn, less patient with bureaucratic inefficiency, more likely to speak up about unfairness even in minor situations. General Morrison noticed the changes and assigned him to work on a special project developing better protocols for service. Members who experienced discrimination or misconduct by local law enforcement. The project gave Marcus a constructive outlet for his anger and frustration. He interviewed dozens of service members about their experiences, documenting patterns of mistreatment. The stories ranged from minor inconveniences to life-threatening encounters. One young private described being pulled over 17 times in the 6 months since he had bought a new car, always near the base, always questioned about whether the car was really his. A captain talked about being detained for hours at a traffic stop because officers did not believe his military ID was real. A female lieutenant shared her experience of being sexually harassed by an officer during a routine stop. Marcus compiled these accounts into a comprehensive report with recommendations for policy changes. He proposed that military bases establish liaison offices with local police departments, that service members receive training on their rights during police encounters, and that a streamlined complaint process be created for incidents involving active duty personnel. General Morrison forwarded the report up the chain of command, and it eventually reached officials at the Pentagon who expressed interest in implementing some of the recommendations service-wide. Meanwhile, the civil lawsuit was also moving forward. David had filed a comprehensive complaint against Derek personally, the police department, and the city, alleging civil rights violations, negligent training and supervision, and intentional infliction of emotional distress. The defendants filed motions to dismiss, arguing qualified immunity and claiming their actions were reasonable under the circumstances. The judge denied most of the motions, allowing the case to proceed. Depositions were taken from multiple witnesses. Marcus spent 2 grueling days being questioned by Thomas Brennan, who tried every angle to discredit his account or suggest he had somehow provoked the incident. Brennan implied that Marcus must have been aggressive or threatening in some way, despite the video evidence to the contrary. He questioned whether Marcus's military service had made him confrontational with authority figures. He even suggested that Marcus was exaggerating the trauma for financial gain in the lawsuit. David objected repeatedly to Brennan's tactics, but Marcus remained composed throughout. He answered every question directly and honestly, never raising his voice or showing the anger he felt inside. When Brennan asked if he hated all police officers because of this incident, Marcus looked the lawyer in the eye and said no. He explained that he understood the difficult job police officers had, and that he respected the many good officers who served their communities with honor. But he also stated firmly that respect did not mean accepting abuse or racism, and accountability was essential for public trust. The deposition of Derek Mitchell was sealed at his lawyer's request, but David told Marcus it had not gone well for the defense. Derek had been evasive, contradicting himself multiple times and becoming defensive when pressed on his use of racial slurs. His claim that he felt threatened fell apart when confronted with the video showing Marcus's complete compliance. The deposition strengthened David's confidence that they would prevail in the civil case, though he cautioned that juries were unpredictable, especially in cases involving police officers. As the trial date approached, Marcus felt the weight of expectation from multiple directions. The military community was watching to see if one of their own would receive justice. Civil rights organizations were monitoring the case as a test of whether police officers could be held accountable for racist actions, even when the victim survived. The local community was divided, with some supporting Marcus and others viewing the prosecution as an attack on police. And Derek's supporters were painting him as a victim of political correctness, a good officer destroyed by a rush to judgment. The night before trial, Marcus could not sleep. He sat in his home office looking at photos from his military career. There was a picture of him as a young second lieutenant, full of idealism and pride. Another showed him with his platoon in Afghanistan, dusty and tired but smiling. A more recent photo captured him receiving a Legion of Merit, one of the highest peacetime decorations for military service. Each image represented a different chapter of his life, all bound together by his commitment to serving something larger than himself. He thought about the oath he had taken when he was commissioned, to support and defend the Constitution against all enemies, foreign and domestic, to bear true faith and allegiance to the same. He had taken that oath seriously, risking his life in combat zones and dedicating decades to the military mission. But now he understood that defending the Constitution meant more than military service. It meant standing up for the rights it guaranteed, fighting for justice when those rights were violated, and refusing to accept that any American should be treated as less than human because of their race. Marcus finally went to bed around 3 a.m, managing a few hours of fitful sleep before his alarm went off. Patricia was already awake, preparing breakfast that neither of them would eat much of. They dressed carefully, Marcus in a suit rather than his uniform on David's advice. The uniform might bias some jurors who were uncomfortable with the military, or who might see it as an attempt to influence the proceedings. He was not Colonel Thompson today. He was Marcus Thompson, a citizen seeking justice. The drive to the courthouse was quiet, both Marcus and Patricia lost in their own thoughts. As they approached the building, they could see news vans already set up and protesters on both sides of the entrance. Some held signs supporting Marcus and calling for police accountability. Others held Blue Lives Matter flags and signs defending Derek. Police officers formed a corridor through the crowd, ensuring everyone could enter the courthouse safely. Marcus walked through that corridor with his head high, knowing that the coming days would test him in ways that even combat had not prepared him for, but determined to see this fight through to its end. The courtroom was packed with spectators, journalists and supporters from both sides. Marcus took his seat at the prosecution table next to the assistant district attorney who would be handling the case, a sharp young lawyer named Keisha Williams. She had a reputation for being thorough and unafraid to take on difficult cases. Across the aisle, Derek sat with Thomas Brennan and a team of defense attorneys, all of them looking confident despite the evidence stacked against their client. Judge Raymond Holland entered and everyone rose. Holland was a black judge in his 60s with a reputation for fairness, but also for running a tight courtroom. He would not tolerate theatrics or procedural games from either side. After some preliminary motions and jury selection that took most of the first day, the trial began in earnest on the second day with opening statements. Keisha Williams laid out the case methodically. She described Marcus's distinguished military service, his unblemished record as a citizen, and his simple plan to drive home on the evening in question. She walked the jury through the traffic stop, emphasizing Marcus's complete compliance and Derek's escalating aggression. She spoke about the gun pressed to M. Marcus's head and the racial slur captured on camera. This was not a case about split-second decisions in a dangerous situation, she argued. This was a case about an officer who targeted a man because of his race and then used his authority to terrorize that man without justification. Thomas Brennan's opening statement painted a different picture. He acknowledged that the incident looked bad, but insisted the jury needed to understand the context. Derek was a young officer working a dangerous beat, trained to be cautious and to control situations quickly. When he stopped Marcus, Brennan claimed, there were factors that made the officer concerned for his safety. The defense would show that Derek's actions, while perhaps not perfect, were within the range of reasonable police responses. The racial slur was regrettable, Brennan admitted, but it was spoken in a moment of high stress and did not prove racial motivation for the stop itself. The prosecution's case unfolded over the next several days. Keisha called witness after witness to establish the facts. The first was Marcus himself. He took the stand and told his story clearly and without embellishment. Under Keisha's questioning, he described his military career, his family, his life in the community. Then he recounted the traffic stop in painful detail, his voice remaining steady even as he described the moment Derek pressed the gun to his head. During cross-examination, Brennan tried to find weaknesses in Marcus's account. He asked whether Marcus had been driving with his music loud, whether he had been on his phone, whether he had made any sudden movements during the stop. Marcus answered each question honestly, admitting he could not remember if his radio was on but certain he had not been on his phone or made any threatening movements. Brennan then tried a different approach, asking if Marcus had been angry about being stopped. Marcus acknowledged that he had been confused and concerned but had controlled his emotions, because he understood the danger of the situation. Brennan pushed harder, implying that Marcus's military training made him intimidating to a young officer. Marcus responded calmly that he had done everything possible to appear non-threatening, including narrating his movements and keeping his hands visible at all times. When Brennan suggested that the stress of military service might have affected Marcus's memory of events, Marcus fixed him with a steady gaze and stated that some moments were impossible to forget, no matter how much one might want to. The body camera footage was played for the jury, and the courtroom fell silent as everyone watched. Some jurors shifted uncomfortably in their seats. One older woman dabbed at her eyes with a tissue. The video was damning, showing Derek's aggression and Marcus's compliance in stark terms. When Derek's racial slur came through the speakers, several jurors visibly reacted with shock or disgust. Brennan objected to the footage being played multiple times, but Judge Holland allowed it, ruling that the jury needed to see the full context. Robert Hayes testified next, and his words carried particular weight as a fellow officer. He described arriving at the scene and immediately recognizing that something was wrong with how Derek was handling the situation. He testified that in his nearly 3 decades of experience, he had never seen a justification for pressing a gun to the head of a compliant citizen during a routine traffic stop. Under cross-examination, Brennan tried to suggest that Robert was motivated by personal animosity toward Derek, but the sergeant denied this firmly, stating that his duty was to the truth and to the integrity of the badge he wore. Sarah Chen, the lieutenant who had supervised the initial response, provided testimony about Derek's demeanor and statements after the incident. She described him as agitated and defensive, offering inconsistent explanations for his actions. She had recommended immediate administrative leave based on what she observed and what the body camera footage showed. Her professional assessment was that Derek had violated department policy and exceeded any reasonable use of force given the circumstances. The prosecution also called Dr. Angela Foster, Marcus's therapist, who testified about the psychological impact of the incident. She explained that Marcus suffered from symptoms consistent with post-traumatic stress, including hypervigilance, sleep disturbances, and acute stress responses to situations involving police. Brennan objected to much of this testimony, arguing it was prejudicial, but Judge Holland allowed it as relevant to the charges of assault, and the emotional harm caused. Perhaps most damaging to the defense was the testimony of former colleagues and citizens who had filed previous complaints against Derek. 3 people told stories remarkably similar to Marcus's experience, describing aggressive stops, unwarranted searches, and racist comments. The defense fought hard to keep this evidence out, but Judge Holland ruled it was admissible to show a pattern of conduct. One witness, a young black man named Terrell Johnson, described being stopped by Derek 5 times in 2 months, always near his own home, always questioned about gang affiliation despite having no criminal record. When the prosecution rested its case, the mood in the courtroom suggested things were going badly for Derek, but Brennan was not finished. The defense case focused on trying to justify Derek's actions through testimony from police training experts and character witnesses. A use of force instructor testified that officers were taught to control situations quickly, and that what might look excessive to civilians was actually standard police practice. Under cross-examination by Keisha, however, the instructor admitted that pressing a gun to the head of a compliant suspect was not standard practice and that the racial slur was never acceptable. Derek's fellow officers testified about his service, describing him as hardworking and dedicated. His former training officer praised his arrest record and his willingness to work difficult shifts. But under cross-examination, these witnesses had to acknowledge that they had not been present at the traffic stop and could not justify Derek's specific actions that evening.
One officer admitted under questioning that he had heard Derek make racially insensitive comments in the past, but had not reported them. The defense then called Derek himself to testify.
It was a risky move, but Brennan clearly felt they needed to humanize his client and give him a chance to explain his actions. Derek took the stand looking nervous but determined. Under Brennan's gentle questioning, he described his training, his years of service, and the dangers he faced on patrol. He claimed that on the evening in question, he had stopped Marcus because the SUV matched the description of a vehicle involved in a recent robbery. This claim immediately raised red flags because it had not appeared in Derek's initial report. Keisha objected, and a sidebar conference was held at the judge's bench. When they returned, Judge Holland instructed the jury to disregard Derek's statement about the robbery report, as there was no documentation to support it, and it appeared to be a newly fabricated justification. The damage to Derek's credibility was immediate. Under cross-examination, Keisha methodically dismantled Derek's testimony. She confronted him with the fact that his story had changed multiple times. She asked him to explain why he had never mentioned a robbery report in his initial statement, if that was truly his reason for the stop. Derek stammered that he had forgotten to include it in the rush of filling out paperwork. Keisha then produced documentation showing there had been no robbery report matching Marcus's vehicle in the weeks prior to the stop. Keisha asked Derek to explain the racial slur captured on camera. Derek claimed it was just words spoken in frustration and did not reflect his true feelings. Keisha asked if he had ever used similar language before. Derek denied it, but his hesitation suggested otherwise. She then asked if he had received complaints about racial bias in the past. Derek admitted there had been complaints but insisted they were all unfounded, made by people trying to avoid accountability for their own actions. The turning point came when Keisha asked Derek a simple question. Why had he drawn his weapon and pressed it to Marcus's head? Derek's answer was convoluted, claiming he thought Marcus might have a weapon and was preparing to attack. Keisha asked what Marcus had done to make him think this. Derek could not provide a clear answer. She then played the body camera footage again, pausing at the moment Derek drew his gun. She asked Derek to point out what threatening action Marcus had taken. There was none visible on the video. Derek's face reddened as he struggled to explain. The final blow came when Keisha asked Derek if he would have treated a white military officer the same way. Derek insisted he would have, that race played no role in his actions. Keisha then presented evidence from traffic stop data, showing that Derek had stopped black drivers at a rate 3 times higher than his fellow officers and that his use of force incidents disproportionately involved people of color. Brennan objected vigorously, but the evidence was already before the jury. Closing arguments took place on the final day of testimony. Brennan made an emotional appeal, arguing that Derek was being made a scapegoat for broader societal issues about policing and race. He insisted that his client had made mistakes but had not committed crimes. Police work was difficult and dangerous, Brennan argued, and officers deserved the benefit of the doubt when they made split-second decisions in stressful situations.